So now we're going to move on to our next session, which is a fireside chat between Phil Venables, who is a senior advisor at Goldman Sachs on operational and cyber risk, and Jack Freund, who is director of risk science at the FAIR Institute. And they're going to talk about measurement issues in cyber, which are so important because, this is an area where we don't have a lot of measurement. Which FAIR has done some pioneering work, and yet we want to try to evaluate what the best ways to quantify some of the risks that we see arising in this area are. So Phil and Jack, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Dick. So yeah, this is Phil Venables. So in this session, we're going to spend some time exploring how to think about cyber risk quantification. I think, as many of you appreciate, compared to measurement of financial risk, I think the measurement of cyber and technology risk has been somewhat less focused on in many organizations, despite a lot of great work from people like Dr. Jack Freund, who Dick mentioned, is the risk science director for RiskLens, which is a cyber risk company and quantification platform that's built on this methodology that Jack and colleagues invented. It's a methodology called FAIR. So over the course of his 20-year career, Dr. Freund has become one of the leading voices in cyber risk measurement and management. He's worked at TIAA as a director of cyber risk, and he's co-author of an award-winning and really great book that I've referenced quite a lot, Measuring and Managing Information Risk. And so one of the things I'd like to kick off is, that we talked a lot about the FAIR methodology, and I think that may be familiar to some, but probably not familiar to a lot of people. So Jack, if you can just kind of take us on a kind of a high-level tour of FAIR and what it is and how it came about.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Phil, for that great introduction. So FAIR began, the origin story of FAIR actually starts with my co-author, Jack Jones, as he was the CISO at Nationwide Insurance at the time in Columbus, Ohio. And the story he tells kind of goes like this. He was new CISO, was putting together a strategic plan for how he wanted to build security up in the organization. And he would go from CTO to CTO. They had line of business CTOs at Nationwide to ask for funding, or as he put it, you make your security plan and then you go, beg the CTOs to fund it for you. And as he was going from one to the other, it was going fine. And then he hit one that said, Jack, this is a great plan. If I give you this money that you're asking for, how much less risk am I going to have? And Jack kind of shrugged and said, less. And he said that he really wished they would have asked for questions like how many less vulnerabilities were you going to have, how many more patch servers you were going to have, because those are the kind of questions that the security industry was ready and able to answer at the time, sort of in early 2000s. And that sort of planted a seed in him to continue to think about, well, how do we answer those questions? They're reasonable questions. How much risk do I have? How much less risk do I have? And that sort of set him up the task of talking to actuaries and others. Several years later, he and I joined forces and did some consulting work and ultimately authored the book. And really what it comes down to, the history of FAIR really is the history of leveraging risk work from other disciplines in the security space. I think far too much we think in cybersecurity that these things that we're doing are unique and there's no possible way that other disciplines have solved these problems, where the reality is, and the converse is actually true. So, leveraging distributions and leveraging Monte Carlo, and that was really the core of where FAIR came from, is trying to solve those types of problems over time. Lots of regular consulting work happened. The book was sort of a landmark in the evolution of FAIR. After that, the creation of the FAIR Institute, the nonprofit organization responsible for promulgating the use of the open source standard FAIR throughout the industry, and that brings us to current.
I mean, so you kind of referenced this was built off, by referencing some risk quantification methodologies in other disciplines. I know and many in the audience will be familiar with this. When you look across some of the disciplines, like in operational risk with loss distribution, advanced measurement, I think there's a fair amount of similarity between the techniques there. I mean, do you think that there's a shared heritage there or an overlap? How do you think about the FAIR in relation to some of the more standard operational risk, capital modeling and risk quantification methodologies?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll tell you a story. During my time at TI Craft, building cyber risk management programs there, we would my team and I were assessing virtually every IT component you could imagine. Application servers, databases. We did data transfers, third parties, all those things. And as I started to link these things together and begin reporting them up, I came across this function that I was relatively unaware of before that, called model risk management, that said, hey, listen, you can't just report quantitative things. You have to make sure that they're vetted. So I began working through a lot of that with them. And what I had discovered was that we had in FAIR actually borrowed a lot of the same techniques from like the loss distribution approach, unbeknownst to us. Like, we didn't set out to look at these things and say, hey, let's do this. So we sort of came to it from like a first principles kind of approach. Like, how do we just build, min, max, and mode values for things, and we ultimately settled on using beta PERT distributions and modeling things with Monte Carlo that way. I think there's miles to go yet in improving a lot of these things, but for the majority of people in cybersecurity, even getting them to think about basic things like a distribution of a loss, I think that's far more mature than they're ready to be at this time. And we've been at this for 15 plus years now. So I think there's a lot of room for more advanced thinking in the way that this goes, but we didn't set out actually to use any of those one or two distributions that we ultimately look like now, but instead came to it just through foundational principles of how should we model, how should we build distributions. So, going through that model risk management function, a lot of we had some external auditors come in to review the FAIR model that I put together. And that's what they had said. They're like, oh, having no cybersecurity background at all, never having looked at a cyber risk quantification model before. As they looked at it, they said, oh, you're basically doing a version of loss distribution approach. Now, I think the difference is between FAIR and those models is that we have decomposed some of the variables down into things that help technical people think about those variables more. So the notion of being able to derive values, I think, is a little bit different than what I've seen from a lot of LDA approaches. And this is helpful, I think, for I always say people, certain disciplines think different ways. So when you come up through a computer science background, for example, you want precision, you want to be able to see those kind of things. You're less comfortable with uncertainty than you would necessarily be otherwise. So for people that are trying to implement risk that way in their cybersecurity program, FAIR gives you the opportunity to think through a lot of the nuts and bolts details of this particular vulnerability and how it applies to the system, and what does this mean to my overall control strength, if they want. As people mature in their thinking and try and model try to make the model represent the decision making a little better, I think they get a little more accustomed to using wider ranges and more distributions that way.
I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned kind of the ability of FAIR. Part of the FAIR methodology is to help people estimate and derive input data into the models, which is, when you look across many of the challenges within operational risk, is some elements of operational risk modeling. There's rich sources of reliable data that help you figure out all of the data you have to plug in terms of frequency and severity that let you drive your models. Whereas in cyber, there's been quite a paucity of that. I mean, so have you found in the application of the FAIR methodology that there's challenges with available data, or is there something different about FAIR that lets people come up with more reliable estimates on their own without having to rely on external sources of data?
Yeah, so data is one of those questions that we get all the time, and there's a couple things I like to say when we discuss about the data for input into FAIR. The first is, I think just on a practical side, if you're presenting a risk report to an organization, to board of directors or senior management, and they ask you where the numbers came from, I think the best answer is, I talked to so-and-so in the organization and I got their input on this. To a much less degree, saying, well, I borrowed numbers from industry and this is how I think it's going to look. I think those numbers are kind of viewed askew a little bit. Like they don't quite, I don't think management in an organization necessarily thinks that they look like everybody else. We're all beautiful, unique snowflakes. But that being said, I think there are lots of good data sources that can be borrowed to do these kinds of things. The second thing, and I'll talk about that in a second, but the second thing I want to say is that part of the other problem that we have with this data is it's very noisy data. So even if you have a lot of data sets, and I've done some recent work with the advising data set, trying to compute materiality of data breaches. I'll be presenting that at a conference coming up here soon. The trouble with this is, one, what I found was the data was very broken. Just for a quick example, this data went back to early 2000s, and there was a difference in those data sets between when the fine was listed in there and when it occurred, early 2000s, and then had another column for something like revenue, and the revenue was a more current number. So those numbers are just mismatched anyway. You can't measure a fine value in 2007 against revenue values in 2019. It's broken data that way. The second thing, we see this in FAIR all the time, we have articulated 6 different loss forms that we help people walk through. And sure, for those that aren't familiar, what we effectively do is borrow activity-based costing methods to think about how loss flows through an organization. So an event happens, and what are all the various and sundry things that come about as a result of this event? And we sort of come up with these 6 categories to help you walk through thinking about them. There's a response cost, there's a replacement cost, there's some competitive advantage impact, fines and judgments, reputational harm, all these kind of things. What you find with a lot of these public data sets is it's one giant chunk of a number. And we don't know what they included, what they didn't include in that number. We don't know how they parse it out. Are they including internal labor rate hours? Are they not? Or are they just including external costs, fines? So without that extra data, it gets a little difficult to really be able to just wholesale take that data and use that. The other factor that we tend to have with this data is, in general, what I say is that organizations don't spend the millions that they do on a cybersecurity program to handle most events. If you look at the distribution of events and the actual amount of loss there, most cybersecurity events are inconsequential overall. And it's sort of a funnel problem, I call it. At the top of the funnel, any organization could experience millions of events of interest per day. But at the bottom of that funnel, there's an actual loss event. And the distance between those two is great. And if you look at the large scale events in our industry, even the ones for which we've had, a couple $1 million worth of fines, those are relatively few. So the overall modeling begins to look a little more like catastrophe modeling than other things, because it's just the dearth of data that really be able to help you model that specifically in your organization. One, is rare, and then 2, probably doesn't reflect your organization's specific forms of loss that you may encounter. You can borrow that data, you can help inform that data, but in the end, what we think is the most valuable thing in FAIR is leveraging subject matter expert estimations. And so a lot of the training that we do to help people is to think through how to be better estimators, how to think through that loss flow in their organization, and then putting ranges on things that way.
I think that's a really great point, because I think one of the criticisms of FAIR and probably other similar methodologies, but we'll focus on FAIR. One of the criticisms of FAIR, I think, is in many respects just the complexity of producing and using a model, and the amount of inputs, and the estimation process, and the expert judgment process, and the refinement. And I think one of the criticisms is you can't apply that degree of rigor to all things. And I think in many cases that criticism is often unfair, because it confuses where you're supposed to use the methodology of the macro versus the micro. I mean, how much do you find that, and how much do you, when you work with organizations to implement FAIR? How much do you have to teach them about the appropriate places to use it versus not?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So I think a lot of organizations, and I was just speaking to this, Silicon Valley cloud provider a couple months ago about the same kind of thing. I think they get either overly skeptical or overly enthusiastic about it. Like, hey, let's apply it to everything, or no, it only applies to these one or two kind of things. I think the important thing to remember is that cyber risk is business risk. This isn't a novel saying, everyone's saying this now, but it's one of those things that really kind of, I think, if you think about it fully and apply it rigorously, means that you have to have a certain elevated way of thinking about that risk. So tying necessarily a particular missing patch to business risk is kind of hard, and you're decomposing the problem in the wrong kind of way. So what I advocate is thinking about at least a three-tier method for things. At an aggregate level, I like to borrow from the Basel risk categories because I think they're relatively applicable to a lot of organizations. You have these large categories of risk. Then applying those at a decomposed level at layer 2, like the business unit level, thinking about the product and services that are offered. Then layer 3 at the cyber scenario level that can be fed into a FAIR analysis. What you find is anything below that level of decomposition doesn't necessarily move the needle enough on any of the actual business level scenarios to be meaningful. So I mentioned before at TICREF where I would put SAP servers and databases and assess all of those. This is the metaphor that I give. When you call into a Geico or a Progressive or somebody like that, they're not building and running bespoke statistical models on your answers over the phone. They're gathering demographic data about you to map you to existing rating tables that are approved by the state departments of insurance. So much the same way, that's how I advise people to think about mapping the micro scenarios to the macro ones. Think about the demographic things about a particular tech stack or about certain types of technology and how they map to other scenarios. So you get high reuse out of your scenarios that way. So for instance, internet-facing systems that have customers logging into it that can access PII as an example, that's a generic set of demographic descriptors that can apply to several applications in your organization. If it's within one line of business, then probably the same loss distribution applies to one as it does the other. So I think that's an important way to go about doing it, is that connection between the micro and the macro, using layering and decomposition that way. Now, the other thing that I say is, if you're building a life cycle approach to doing this, and you have risk teams in your organization that are assessing these things over time, it's important to kind of build your own rating tables for these kind of things. Talking to and refreshing those tables annually tends to be relatively enough for these types of scenarios. There's not as much volatility necessarily on a year-over-year basis, unless there's big events that happen that require you to shift those kinds of things. So the data that you gather in those initial sessions can be reused in lots of other sessions. In other words, if you're doing 15 initial risk analyses and you're trying to build some different distributions of loss for cyber, and you've gone and talked to the chief privacy officer and the heads of business and the 10 lines of business in your organization, et cetera, the next 5 you do doesn't necessarily require another visit to those same people to gather more data. You can probably reuse a lot of that same data. So data reuse, I think, is big, and then thinking about decomposing these scenarios to useful levels, but no further.
I mean, a lot of organizations, when they go down the path of trying to improve their rigor and use of quantitative methods, whether it's FAIR or kind of self-crafted ones or other ones, I mean, do you see, I mean, it's that point of either getting kind of over enthusiastic about things. Do you think that they throw away too many qualitative methods, or what's the right balance between the quantitative and the qualitative in cyber risk?
Well, I think they can live peacefully and they can coexist for sure. One of the things I'm slightly cynical about this, right? So if you know enough about a particular scenario to know that it's high risk, but at the same breath, you're claiming you don't know enough to be able to put a number around it. That sort of doesn't fit well, and there's sort of an intellectual dishonesty there. But I think those verbal risk labels are important for quickly sorting things at different levels of the organization. I need to know what my high risk servers are. I need to know what my high risk business functions are. That's a natural thing. What I say and what I advise people to do, especially if you're trying to integrate a quantitative cyber program into a more flexible, open, qualitative program overall, as I had to do at TICREF in the beginning at least, was to use the quantitative to build a discipline for how you choose those labels. It's relatively straightforward to build a translation table that says, well, out of my organization, I'm not going to say anything's critical risk until it's $10 million or more with an annualized loss or single loss event exposure. So that type of discipline in translation is helpful that way, because in the end, we're always going to need to have a quick sort of things. And I disagree with some in the cyber measurement industry that talks about the abolition of the use of heat maps as an example. I think they're a great tool for displaying risk, but not for deriving those values. I think there are better methodologies for coming up with loss values, but I think it's fine to take those numeric outputs and say, okay, on this scale, here's how we're coming up with what these color-coded results are to make sure that we justify them. I think the error that we make is when we use those values directly and we say, okay, on this scale here, according to this chart, I think this is high. But when somebody challenges you and asks you questions about how you came up with that value, I think sometimes without a solid quantitative analysis underneath it, we fall short of being able to really justify our thoughts.
I'd say that's interesting. It's almost like the value in the qualitative is in the risk communication of the quantitative, which I think is kind of resonant of many other risk disciplines as well. And by the way, for everybody in the audience, I see a few questions coming in, but I've got a few more questions, and I'm going to start going to the audience Q&A. So if people have got more questions, you can start queuing them up. And Jackie, you mentioned earlier, you kind of touched on a little bit of reference to kind of catastrophe risk and related disciplines. I was going to ask about when you think about FAIR, how much is it applicable to kind
I think you went on mute, Phil.
Yeah, sorry, I'm back. So you kind of mentioned
catastrophe risk earlier. I was just curious how much is the methodology tied to expected losses, and does it work applicably in the tail, or does it at what point on the distribution does it start breaking down, or do you have to adjust the methodology?
Yeah, so at a practical level, we ask people to estimate things with a 95% confidence interval. So 95% on each end, 90% overall. So you're really at best at the 95th percentile in the tail. I have done some, adjusted the inputs in the modeling a little bit to do CTE 99 for those kinds of things. And you can get there with that, but it requires different data libraries. So those rating tables I mentioned earlier are really meant for expected to 95th percentile, those kinds of things. But you'd have to re-estimate them at that tail to get different data that way.
We kind of one question in from the audience, which is actually something I was going to ask as well, which is, do you see any regulators or even internal or external auditors taking on board this methodology, either specifically FAIR or a FAIR-like methodology, to not just as to how they would assess and rate a particular organization, but also how they would compare among organizations and maybe even draw that together to get some view of systemic risk?
Yeah, I think what you're seeing is a lot of regulators are starting to talk about the need for quantitative cyber risk broadly, or FAIR in particular. So just the other day, the National Association of Corporate Directors, the NACD, they released a paper where it calls out FAIR by name. This is one of the methods that you can use to quantify cyber risk. As far as regulatory frameworks go, most regulatory things don't name any standards by name. They tend to think about things broadly, things such as quantitative risk management. That being said, we've been the FAIR Institute and the FAIR methodology have been referenced by COSO by name is one of those methodologies that can aid in decision making using quantitative risk management. I'm trying to remember. So last year I did some work with NIST, and FAIR is referenced in the NIST CSF framework in a section that they call informative references that provide additional implementation guidance for how to do those kinds of things. And over the years, from PCI over a decade ago, reference FAIR to part of the standards working group, we've also released guidance and documentation on how to integrate FAIR into ISO methodologies, ISO, NIST, COSO, PCI, NACD. A lot of these organizations are just sort of coming to terms with, one, it can be measured, and then two, here are some approaches for how to do that. So I think you're seeing that happen quite a bit. Anytime I've had to sit across from regulators and discuss how I'm doing things and utilizing this quantitative approach, it's gone very well. They typically don't see this, in my experience. A lot of the bank examiners and others, for example, don't see anything more than relative qualitative approach for things, or those kind of capital modeling functions where they've been include a couple of cyber scenarios in their overall RBC functions.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because I've got another question that's coming from the audience in relation to, this is kind of is obviously related to the kind of the stress question, but have you seen anybody using this in the context of CCAR or other kind of kind of stress calculations? I mean, I know in a number of organizations I'm familiar with, especially when you're using kind of AMA style approaches, as part of stress testing that applies. I mean, I'm guessing the methodology is probably applicable to things like CCAR as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So my time at TI-CREF, I did that. I know some people at some other financial institutions are doing it. It's a small handful of people that are doing it. What tends to happen is if an organization's doing any sort of AMA or CCAR kind of thing, what they're typically doing is utilizing those custom formulas for those types of capital risk modeling. And if they're using scenarios, they're pulling in from a mature function that's using FAIR. Otherwise, it tend to be pushed down. They don't think about it too much. I think for organizations that are trying to build this up internally, what I've discovered is that there's few others that have the source, that has the wealth of data that can be used to input into those functions, whether you're using FAIR directly for it or using another modeling methodology for it. So for example, in what I did, these organizations that were doing that capital modeling came to me and said, "Hey, we need this data." Sorry, these internal organizations came and said, "We need some data to do this. We have some scenarios," and I had a library at that point of over 100 scenarios that I was modeling with data to support them. So it was really easy for them to say, let's leverage that data to do this. And what did your data already come up with? So that was a really healthy conversation with them to do that. And again, at the time, I was only modeling at the 95th percentile, and they wanted to model the 99th percentile. So it required a little bit of changes to that model to make that work. But I think for some organizations, and this applies particularly to financial services, but FAIR has been in use and across all industries. The whole concept of a rainy day fund if bad things happen, I think, is a mature way of thinking about managing any organization. So if you're not, responsible for doing risk-based capital modeling, or you don't have that regulatory requirement, even just thinking about it like, hey, what if a really bad thing happened at the 95th percentile, I think is more than a lot of organizations think about cyber risk today. So I think that's helpful enough.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've got a question in around do we see a large increase in cyber risk in periods like the crisis we're going through now, and in the previous financial crisis and other kind of crises? And I guess I'll kind of extrapolate that question a little bit to say, just your opinion on whether we're seeing increased risk now, but also in the work that you do with organizations and their use of modeling. Are they finding the models useful to kind of re-parameterize things in a different context to help them figure out what to do next? Or at moments of high stress, do people just give up on the modeling and go back to kind of good old-fashioned kind of real-time personal judgment? How are you seeing all of that?
Right. Well, I think we'll find out. Some of these things tend to be lagging in terms of figuring out, was there increase in risk that way? What I'll tell you is, using fair terminology, I think we're seeing an increase in threat event frequency. So those attempted kinds of things, criminals are nothing if not opportunistic. So, I've seen some things come through the FBI channels around different types of phishing attacks using COVID themed phishing lures as a way to snag people in. A lot of the work from home stuff with our work at RiskLens, we've been doing a lot of work from home risk assessments for organizations. A friend of mine, a CISO at an insurance company, came to me to ask around some of his outsourced providers offshore also have to work from home because everybody's been asked to do that everywhere. And so he's trying to, get some sense around what the risk looks like. His organizations for that offshore provider not working out of a clean room. So I think people are thinking about these things in different ways. And I think some of them that have a mind for modeling risks this way are coming to it the same way. And that is applying the risk models as they would for their everyday analyses to here in extreme times. Others that aren't familiar with those methods, they may be doubling down on what they already think about it or falling back to what feels comfortable. So that may be true. But in the end, I think we may be experiencing a higher frequency of these types of events. But I guess time will tell if we're seeing higher impact of these types of events. So I think that's a distinction that is important to make.
Yeah, and kind of a little bit of a variant to that as well, which is, it comes back to this kind of question of the adaptability of the methodology and the frequency you need to update things. And you kind of referenced before kind of building out multiple scenarios that you can then use as a basis to generate new scenarios. I mean, one of the challenges I think in cyber risk, more than many risk disciplines, is the character of it changes quite frequently because the way businesses are connected, the way supply chains are connected, new technologies, new concentration risks like cloud services, new attacks, all different depth of new technology that appears and new threats. It's a very complex environment, and in many cases as well, it can also be kind of almost a game theoretic environment where there's rational actors facing you that evolve their attacks as your defenses evolve, and that goes on. So in that complex environment, have you found the methodology still stands, or again are the limits to where you just have to say the methodology is applicable to one set of things and we're thinking of new and different techniques for another set of things, or is it manageable through that complexity?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've come to in my years of doing this is that cyber can sometimes require a lot to move the needle and sometimes very, very little. And it really comes down to the level of decomposition that you're working at with these kinds of things. So in general, what I will tell you is that thinking about cyber and IT in general more as risk triggers and less as risk scenarios is very, very helpful. So there may be hundreds of different ways. MITRE ATT&CK framework, for example, documents a couple hundred different attack types. But in the end, the type of loss you may see from that is relatively singular. So there might be 100 ways to break into a system and negotiate your way through a network, lateral escalation, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end, what you end up having is a data breach. And we have lots of good data around data breaches that we can leverage and model within our organization. So that's then my experience with it, is that while there may be lots of ways to get in the end game is pretty singular in the way that we think about modeling it. In as much threat modeling as we do in FAIR, which is different than a lot of discipline-based threat modeling. So we're thinking more about threat modeling as a doer-based kind of activity in FAIR. Who's doing it? What are their relative skill sets compared to my relative control strength? So that type of modeling tends to be higher level than type of threat modeling you might do if you're building out a particular application and you want to make sure you've covered all your bases. They're compatible. I'm working with a team at Carnegie Mellon to sort of work through some of these threat modeling based things. And we keep coming to this point where, well, that's a risk-based thing. We need to understand the business, and then sort of hand off the FAIR to get a sense of priority for these things. But other than that, they're trying to look at all the ways you can get in. So I think it's difficult for a lot of people to hold both of those models in their head at the same time. One which is at a business level, relatively few things can go wrong that can cause a big impact like that. But at a tech level, hundreds of things can go wrong all day long. Which of these hundreds of things I'm worrying about are the ones that are going to trigger those big business risk things that I need to focus on the most. So translating between those two does require a little bit of skill, but a lot of mapping things have gone between them to make sure they can understand those a little bit better. The Fair Institute has been doing some work on that to help people.
Yeah, and I've seen a number of organizations also use things like Bayesian network modeling to model kind of risk and control paths and then simulate different types of failures through those risk and control paths. How does that relate to FAIR? Would you class that as complementary, or would you class that as being modeling that can underpin some of the kind of the nodes in FAIR? How do you think about Bayesian network modeling?
Yeah, absolutely. So first let me say that when we think about that kind of modeling, language matters, and at least when we think about it from a FAIR perspective, we have a very defined ontology for how we think about these terms. So what a lot of organizations will do, especially a lot of like nonprofits, and I mentioned MITRE before, and they do really great work. It's difficult to have a conversation if we're conflating the terms risk, threat, and vulnerability all day long, like we do in cybersecurity all day long. So what we try and advocate for in the FAIR Institute is being consistent in the way that we think about these languages. I'm not necessarily threatened by inanimate objects, right? So there has to be a doer behind them that cause me harm in this fashion. So different types of attacks that we may see, different types of control weaknesses or vulnerabilities are important, but in and of themselves, they don't really have any velocity to them without a doer behind them. So in FAIR, we model threat activity based upon the doer, who is doing it, and how often they're doing it, and then what skill set do they have to bring to bear when they're doing it. When they're leveraging those skill sets, how do we apply them? And this matters a lot when we think about control strength as well. I always joke that my mom is a terrible, terrible hacker. Great nurse, terrible hacker. So if I hit Control Alt Delete on my laptop, she can't get through that. But I know that the Russian GRU can. So control strength is relative to the attacker that way. Not necessarily the attack. I can give my mom all the attacks in the world, and she can only leverage a handful of them. The skill set matters as well. So I think that's an important way to think about it. And in terms of that Bayesian piece of it, I think that's brilliant as well. We like to say that the inverse tree in FAIR that we've developed with that taxonomy is in and of itself a Bayesian view of things. And if you're updating the frequency and magnitude of events over time, you're sort of building a de facto Bayesian belief network to help model those things better as time evolves.
We had another question's come in around how does FAIR help you manage residual exposure? So I guess another way of saying that is, when you're developing a FAIR model and you're going to decide what degree of risk mitigation to apply to bring yourself into some risk appetite as defined in the model, how does the model then express what residual risk remains to enable you to decide whether that's acceptable? And would that be a more general thinking of residual risk, or would you then apply it to particular assets, like your most critical information assets?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the variables for control strength work in two different ways. One, they're either preventing a loss from happening, or they're allowing you to detect and recover from a loss when they do happen, which is materially expressed through changes in frequency or changes in loss magnitude on the left and right side of the equations. So in practice, when I've done this, I've built models and run them twice. You can run them without any controls at all, and we can have a theoretical debate around whether zero controls are possible. I don't necessarily think so, but people tend to find that a useful value, so I'll compute that. So that sort of builds this inherent view of what risk looks like. And then reducing it by some measures of control strength down to residual makes sense that way too. So at that scenario level, what I would end up doing is, if you recall, attaching a set of technology stacks to those scenarios. And in them, what I would do is set these thresholds. So based upon some conversations I had with management in the organization, I'd say, here's where I think, loss looks like at a level like this. They'd get feedback, we'd adjust it. And then I would measure the number of applications or servers or databases that could contribute to a scenario where we would exceed that. So again, the technology itself does not exceed appetite. It contributes to a scenario where we would exceed appetite. So that's the way that I would sort of measure that. And I'd build key risk indicators around, the number of applications, for example, that would exceed the appetite target given by the organization. So, 34% of our applications could exceed appetite. And if you wanted to fix that in a more actionable sense, as you move down through the organization, those KRIs were good at the chief risk officer level, at the executive level. And then as you move down through the organizations, I'd say you, line of business, chief technology officer, owner, you have 10 applications that could exceed appetite, and here's the 5 controls you need to rectify in order to bring it back into tolerance. So that was a helpful practical way of taking this sort of abstract notion of appetite and residual risk down to so what do I got to do to move out of red kind of things you get at a more tactical IT level.
And you mentioned earlier at the very beginning that FAIR is now an open source methodology, and I'm presuming you as the RiskLens organization are pretty solid maintainers of the methodology. Are you finding you're getting a lot of just like with any open source software or open source methodology, are you getting a lot of changes from the community, or is that mostly driven by you guys?
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, we made FAIR open source the early 2000s, maybe 2010, in that time frame, with an organization called the Open Group. So those are standards you can go and download right now. Since then, you've seen a lot of people building their own FAIR methodologies in places like R and spreadsheets, and within the community of cyber risk people, I've seen a lot of these things go by. Even FAIR training courses that are open source now. Yeah, so RiskLens has built an enterprise-grade version of this. So if you're trying to manage this type of complexity with spreadsheets at an enterprise level, it gets hairy pretty fast. So the RiskLens, cloud-based platform gives you a lot of reusability and workflow, and to keep those things managed that way, which is really important. As far as community feedback, I think one of the most recent examples I can give of that is I've been doing some work with the federal government around their adoption of FAIR, in particular the Department of Energy. And some of the feedback I've gotten there is interesting too, and it will probably result in some edits and changes in different places. One of the big things that I've heard is the notion of safety. And this is really a matter of, their perception of the models that it was born in private sector, so that you have to have some sort of commercial interest to be able to apply the model. So I've actually been working most recently on work on government on FAIR, an extension to FAIR that was to help apply it to them, and thinking about notions of like safety or mission risk or impact to citizenry. I've sort of adopted these different views of loss dimensions to help these organizations think about these things. As a real quick example, one of their feedback items was, well, we work in the public sector, we don't have competitive advantage risk. And I happened to be listening to a podcast that was talking about the distinction between AI and ML research in the US and China versus the EU zone countries. And part of the problem I heard from the source that because of GDPR laws, AI and ML research in the EU zones is lacking because they can't get access to good data to train their systems on, because everyone has to opt into things. And here in the US and China, we just give data away for free with no restrictions. So it occurred to me at that point that, of course, there's nation-state level competitive advantage, and it really depends on how you're scoping the analysis. Are we talking about a particular agency, a particular scenario? We're talking about broad scale impact across nation state. So the dimensions of loss really help with the scoping side of it. On a computational side, it works the same way. It's really just around how you're feeding data into the model and how you're thinking about what a scenario is that I think is going to get a lot of edits.
Right. That was great. I see we're out of time now, but like that I think that was fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on and answering these questions. And I think, as we've seen in other disciplines, I think the quantification of cyber risk is is most definitely time has come, given how much everything else depends on that. So with that, thank you, Jack, and I'll hand back to Dick and Rob and Matt and the team for the rest of the agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil.